Today's video is a little different. This story took me a long time to feel ready to share. It took a lot of time, healing, and reflection to understand what this experience taught me. But in all areas of my life, I try my best to be raw and honest, because I believe the deeper conversations, the ones many people avoid, are where real healing begins. There was a moment in my life where I realized something very important. The moment you stop reacting, everything begins to change. Several years ago, something happened that completely changed the trajectory of my life. Before it happened, I read a quote. I don't remember the exact wording now, but the essence of it stayed with me. It said something like this: how you respond in this moment will speak volumes. At the time, I didn't realize how significant those words would become. But very soon after that, my entire world shifted. My father had already passed away, and for the first time in my life, I felt the door open to speak about parts of my story that had remained silent for many years. It took nearly a decade of healing after his death before I was ready to write my book, Uprooting Shame and Guilt. And when I finally shared those experiences honestly, something very painful happened. Some of the people I loved most turned against me. The messages started coming in, the accusations, anger, words meant to hurt. Some of it even spilled onto my public platforms, and the intensity of it was something I could never have imagined. What made it especially painful was that those were relationships I had carried for most of my life, simply because they were family. Many of us grew up believing belonging means we must stay connected, even when something inside of us has never truly felt at home there. For years, I believed love and loyalty would always remain. But when I spoke my truth, something shifted. And suddenly, the people I loved were standing on the other side of the storm. When the messages began, when the accusations started, I had a choice. I could defend myself, I could explain, I could try to force them to understand. But something inside me told me to stay still, to remain grounded, so I did something that felt almost impossible in that moment. I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have nothing to say, but because I realized that defending myself would only pull me deeper into the chaos. Instead, I allowed them to feel whatever they were feeling. I didn't retaliate. I didn't try to win. I let the pieces fall where they would. Privately, I prayed for them. I wished them peace, but I also grieved deeply. There were nights when the pain felt unbearable. I remember lying on the floor, curled into myself, grieving the loss of those relationships. Because sometimes the hardest thing we can ever do in life is accept that people we love cannot meet us where we are. And at one point, the pain was so heavy that a dark thought crossed my mind, just for a moment. The idea that I could slip beneath the water in the bathtub and end the pain. And I remember sitting there, realizing just how deeply I was hurting. But the moment that thought appeared, something inside of me rose up, and I said out loud, no, they will never have that power over me. That moment became a turning point. So I began the real work of healing. It took time, deep inner work, grief, reflection, and growth. But something powerful emerged through that process. I became stronger. Not the kind of strength that comes from fighting or proving something to anyone, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are. And when I look back on that time now, I feel something I didn't expect. I feel pride. Pride in the way I chose to handle that moment. Pride that even in the middle of all that pain, I didn't allow it to turn me into something I didn't want to be. And now I understand something with absolute clarity. No matter what life places in front of me, there is nothing I will face that I will not rise from. For years, I carried that grief quietly and did my healing in silence. And over time, I had to accept something difficult. Those relationships were never repaired. I grieved them, and eventually I released them. Because I cannot change what happened, and I cannot unsee what I came to understand. But I also came to understand something important. Sometimes love doesn't mean continuing the relationship. Sometimes love means allowing distance. We can still care about someone. We can still wish them peace. And at the same time, recognize that your paths are no longer meant to walk together. And I often reflect on how differently the old version of me would have handled that moment. The old version of me would have defended myself, over-explained, tried desperately to make everyone understand. But through that experience, I came to see something very clearly. Some of the deepest lessons we carry are not learned through theory. They're learned through living them. Because I didn't just study these things, I lived them. I know what it feels like to be pulled into reaction. And I know what it takes to choose something differently. And I'll say it again. That experience changed me. And it deepened my commitment to this work I do. Because there is a cost to sharing your life honestly with the world. To speak about the harder parts of being human. But that experience also ignited something inside of me. It's part of what led me to create my YouTube channel, my Dear Rising Soul podcast, and the Return to Self Academy. I took my pain and poured it into healing so that others might find their own voice, so others might discover the strength that already exists within them. Because at the end of the day, love is the only way forward. And the most sacred love we'll ever learn is self-love. When that kind of love takes root, peace becomes a place you lead from. Forgiveness becomes more important than bitterness. Peace becomes more important than revenge. And we begin to choose the path that keeps our own hearts free. A choice about how we respond, and that idea reminds me of something Viktor Frankl once wrote. Viktor Frankl, a neurologist and psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, wrote something powerful in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." In that idea, the freedom to choose how we respond to what happens in our lives is exactly what this episode is about. Many of us believe our reactions are choices, but most of the time, they aren't. They're patterns. When something triggers us, criticism, rejection, misunderstanding, conflict, the nervous system quickly moves. And in many cases, those reactions were learned long ago. From the environments we grew up in, from the dynamics within our families, from the ways we learned to protect ourselves. So the reaction isn't really about the present moment. It's an old pattern rising up, trying to keep us safe in the only way it knows how. But something else often happens in that moment too. After the reaction, many of us immediately turn on ourselves. We begin shaming ourselves. Why did I say that? Why did I react that way? What's wrong with me? Instead of understanding the pattern, we start tearing ourselves apart. And for some of us, reaction doesn't always look explosive. In my own life, I was rarely someone who reacted outwardly. My upbringing had conditioned me to stay quiet, to look perfect, to be perfect. So most of my reactions happened internally. From the outside, it probably looked like I was calm. But inside, there was often a very different experience. The thoughts, the judgments, the emotional waves I never spoke out loud. I could feel frustration, I could feel irritation, I could even feel judgment towards others. But I had learned to keep it inside. And it wasn't until I began my deeper healing journey that I started noticing these patterns more clearly. I remember one moment very vividly. I was sitting on the couch one day. My husband walked down the stairs, and almost immediately a thought appeared in my mind, a quiet judgment about something he had done. I don't even remember now what the situation was about, but what stayed with me was the awareness that followed. For the first time, instead of simply believing the thought, I saw it. I recognized it as a pattern, a habit of reacting internally. Around the same time, I had just finished reading a book called The Untethered Soul. One of the central ideas of that book is learning to step back and notice the voice in your mind, the constant stream of thoughts, reactions, and judgments running through our heads. The author talks about becoming the observer of your life, almost like becoming the quiet roommate of your own mind. You start listening to the thoughts instead of immediately believing them. And that idea stayed with me because in that moment on the couch, when the judgmental thought about my husband appeared, something different happened. Instead of just going along with a thought, I noticed it, I heard it, and I realized that thought wasn't me. It was a pattern my mind had learned, and that created awareness. And that awareness created space, a small space, but an important one. Because the moment you can observe the thought instead of becoming the thought, you are no longer completely inside the reaction. You've stepped back from it. And that moment of awareness is exactly what Viktor Frankl was pointing to when he wrote about the human freedom to choose how we respond to our circumstances. That moment can feel very small, sometimes only a few seconds, but it's there. It's the moment where you notice what is happening inside of you, the surge of emotions, the urge to respond, the pull to defend yourself. And instead of acting immediately, you pause, you breathe, you observe. Not everything that triggers us requires a reaction. Not every accusation requires a defense. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. And when we begin sitting inside that space, something important starts to shift. Because most of us were never taught that we actually have power in these moments. Many of us were taught the opposite, that our emotions control us, that other people control how we feel, that life happens to us. But when you begin doing the deeper work of healing and awareness, you start seeing something very different. You begin realizing that you have far more influence over your inner world than you were ever led to believe. The pause becomes a place of power. Instead of being pushed by every emotion or pulled into every conflict, you begin choosing how you respond. You begin reclaiming the driver's seat of your own life. And the more awareness you develop, the less reactive you become. Not because life stops bringing challenges, but because you no longer feel controlled by every external moment. You feel grounded, present, centered in yourself. And that is where self-leadership truly begins. Many people believe power comes from reacting quickly, from defending yourself, from proving your point, from winning the argument. But often the opposite is true. Sometimes the most powerful response is restraint. Because when you stop reacting automatically, several things begin to change. You stop feeding conflict. You stop allowing other people's behavior to dictate your emotional state. And instead of being pulled into every situation, you begin choosing how you want to show up. From clarity, from self-respect, from a deeper understanding of who you are. As you practice becoming the observer of your life, watching your thoughts, your reactions, and even the behavior of the people around you, you begin to see things differently. Almost like watching a story unfold, like watching characters in a movie. You begin realizing that you don't have to step into every scene. You don't have to respond to every character in the story. You can pause, you can step back, and choose how you want to respond. Because the more awareness you develop, the more you realize that you always have choice. You can step out of the patterns that once controlled you. You can return to your center. And that return becomes easier the more honest you are with yourself. The more willing you are to sit in stillness and face what is true inside you. Because a place where we stop lying to ourselves, where we become raw and honest about what we are carrying and what we feel, is a place where clarity begins. And when clarity begins, something shifts. Instead of being pushed through life by old reactions, you begin responding with awareness. You begin choosing. And that is where freedom starts to appear. As we come to the end of this conversation, I want to leave you with something to reflect on. Where in your life do you feel pulled to react the most? Is it a certain person, a certain type of conversation, a moment where you feel misunderstood or judged? And what might change if, just once, you chose to pause instead of react, to breathe, to observe what is happening inside of you, and to respond from awareness instead of old patterns. Because every time you choose that pause, you reclaim a little more of your power. And the more often you return to that space, the more freedom begins to appear in your life. If this conversation resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe so these conversations continue appearing in your space. And if you'd like to explore this work more deeply, the Self-Love Bootcamp Masterclass inside the Return to Self Academy is linked below. We go much deeper there into understanding, conditioning, emotional patterns, and learning how to lead your life from clarity instead of reaction. And if you haven't yet watched the earlier episode, How You Were Conditioned to Be Afraid, I recommend starting there. It connects directly to what we explored today. And with much love, I'll leave you here.